I think, well, I can't guarantee that what I'll talk about tonight will completely fall in line with what Rabbi Wilhelm said I was going to talk about, but maybe I should not have given that disclaimer and just allowed things to unfold as they will. There's a story told of a yidel in a village who made his living by selling merchandise, whatever it was, crops or shiur of some sort. And unfortunately, he didn't do terribly well. It was always a struggle. He had little children in the house, a wife, a household to support, and there was a lot of struggle and stress. And this concerned his wife, obviously, and so she asked him for him to tell her a little bit about what going to the market, when he went to the town or the nearby city where he would sell his wares at the market, what his day was like. And so he told her, he says, I leave in the middle of the night with the wagon with the merchandise, and I ride with the horses whatever the ways was, a few hours, and I arrive in town early in the morning, and I go right to the shul, and I daven shachris. And usually after shachris, there's somebody has a yard site, or there's some other event, and so I maybe stick around for a little while, and then after a little l'chaim and a little farbaisen, I'm on my way to the market. And she says, so why do you often come back with so much of your merchandise unsold? And he says, I'll tell you the truth, sometimes by the time I get out to the market and by the time I set up my wares and all of that, it's already midday and all the early buyers have already come and gone. And so I just don't have a chance to get rid of everything. So she was an intuitive woman, and she said, why don't I accompany you to the marketplace? I'll help you out. I'll support you, and I'll be there to help get everything set up and all of that. Fine, no problem. So the day before, he loads up the wagon with his wares, and they go, again, in the middle of the night, they leave, riding together for a few hours, and they arrive just after the dawn. They arrive into the town, and he tells his wife, as per the usual, I'm going to go to shul, daven shachris, and after shachris, we'll go, set up our wares and begin our day. And she says, that's fine. I have no problem with that. She says, but I know your tendency, and you've told me that you tend to stick around for a while sometimes, and it takes you a while till you get up and start it and leave shul. And so I want you to know that I expect you that as soon as you're finished davening, I expect that you'll put your tefillin away and you'll come out and we'll go together. And he says, my wife, you have my word. Well, Yankel goes in and he davens shachris with the minyan, and sure enough, as was typical, someone had a yard site that morning and put out a little farbaisen, a little schnapps, and as he's leaving, he's wrapping up his tefillin, and he sees people saying l'chaim and giving a bracha that the neshama should have an aliyah. He doesn't want to lose out that opportunity to participate. He figures, what's a quick l'chaim? I'll say l'chaim, I'll have a little farbaisen, and I'll be on my way. My wife won't even notice. So he does. And being that he had been there a number of times, on his previous trips to this particular town, they knew him, and they knew that he enjoyed to stay around generally. And so after a l'chaim, the Baal Simcha, or the person who was propping the yard site, says to him, "No, come sit down. Sit with us for a little bit, like we usually do." He's thinking in his mind, he should, he shouldn't, but anyway, he convinces Rabbi Yankel, come say another l'chaim. So he says another l'chaim, and he sits down, and he begins to farbreng, and 2 l'chaims lead to 3 and to 4, and before long, he's having a grand old time. His wife is out in front of the shul on the wagon, and she's thinking to herself, okay, Shachris should have taken, 45 minutes, an hour. It's already a little past that. Wonder where he is. So she figures she'll give him a few more minutes, but minutes pass and he doesn't come out. She's left with no choice. She gets down from the wagon and figures she'll go into the shul and see for herself what's going on. So she goes in, and she sees the scene that she hoped she wouldn't have seen. She sees a number of men sitting around having l'chaim, enjoying each other's company, talking, clearly having a good time, seemingly not a care in the world. And she spots across the room her husband. She sees him, and she's obviously upset. She's quite angry, and she couldn't contain herself, and she yells across the shul. She says, "Yankel, what are you doing? We had a deal. You said you were going to daven and come, and look at you here. You're sitting. This is probably what happens every time. Now we're already running late, and how are we going to, get the merchandise up in time and get it all set up? We're probably going to miss some of the early buyers, and here the pattern is repeating itself." So he says, "My dear wife," he says, "what's your concern?" She says, "What do you mean, what's my concern? We have kids at home. We have to feed them. We have kids to clothe. We have all these responsibilities. We have household expenses and so forth. What do you mean, what's my concern? How are we going to make a proper living? We've been scraping by, and enough is enough of this." And he stops and he pauses for a moment and he looks at her and he says, "Tell me, why is that so important to you?" She says, "Why is it so important? What do you mean? Our kids, food, clothing, etc." And he says, "And if we'll have all that, then what?" So she says, "Well, I think it's obvious, but in case it's not obvious, if we have all that, then we will have more of a comfortable life. We will have more money to buy better food. We give more tzedakah. We can be machnas orchim. We can do things that we've never been able to do." And he says, "And if you'll be able to do that, then what?" And she's taken aback by his questioning. And so this goes back and forth each time she says, that if we'll have this, then we'll have, more of this. We'll be able to do this. Finally, he says, "Nu, and then what?" And she says, "Well, and then we'll be happy." He says, "Happy? I'm happy right now. Not a care in the world." And so, with this anecdote, it brings to mind that there is a relationship, a well-known relationship. It doesn't take any sort of person with any education to know that there's a relationship between at least the perception of happiness and alcohol, or I should say the opposite, the perception drinking wine and the perception of happiness. We often hear that, and it's often the reason that people cite for enjoying a glass of wine, scotch, vodka, etc. But in considering what is happiness and what the role of wine and other alcoholic beverages in that in that happiness, it's worthwhile to look a little bit deeper at what the relationship is. Torah certainly has something to say about this, and I certainly would not claim that what I'll talk about tonight is a comprehensive treatment of the subject. I will also give the disclaimer that I am not an expert on happiness, and I'm probably not an expert on the effects of alcohol. But maybe there's something to share tonight. So the Rebbe has an interesting discussion about happiness, about Simcha, and I found it in Sha'ar Moedim. It must be from somewhere else, but I can't find the citation. I couldn't quickly enough anyway. Where the Rebbe talks about 7 dimensions or 7 levels of Simcha. And these 7 levels of Simcha are divided into 2 categories. 3 levels of Simcha that are relevant to creation in general, and then 4 levels that are specifically additional levels of Simcha that are shaykh to Yidden in particular. The first level of Simcha that the Rebbe talks about is the Simcha of every creation due to his very existence. So the fact that we exist, and that we exist from the Eibishter himself, this idea that we are that the Eibishter, who has the ability to create anything from nothing to something, created us. This thought has the ability to bring about a simcha in and of itself, and this could be the thought that I was created, or that anything was created, the existence of things in our world. Interestingly, the Rebbe adds to the end of this description the words "Ad she'ein lecha simcha gedola mizu," that there is no greater simcha than this. So, should we be able to maximize the power of that happiness and that joy, that is arguably the greatest simcha. A second level in simcha, the Rebbe says, is an additional simcha or a greater simcha, in that we, as Jews, as humans, but as Yidden in particular, were created in the likeness of the Eibishter. This likeness of the Eibishter is that just like the Eibishter feels his own self, his own yeshus, his own existence, we were created and given the ability to have that similar feeling. Now, throughout Chassidus, there's extensive discussions about the potential pitfalls of our sensing of our own yeshus, but that's a discussion for another time. But the point that we are able to experience that feeling of oneness also has the potential to allow us to achieve great things, and so this idea, again, brings about, or has the capability of bringing about, a great simcha by us. A third level of simcha is that the Eibishter created specific times, mayadim l'simcha, specific times in the year. So this is not in the dimension of the person, but in the dimension of time, that there are times of particular joy, and in particular Chag HaSukkos, because Sukkos is Man Simchasenu, as well, as I'll mention in a moment, but this is a third level of Simcha. As I said, the 4th through 7th levels of Simcha, these are levels that are specifically shaykh to us as Yidden. So to go through them fairly quickly, number 4 is a level of Simcha that a person has when he senses that he has merited to fulfill his mission to serve the Eibishter, l'shamish es koinai, and that through his bechira he can choose to serve the Eibishter. So having the choice to serve the Eibishter gives us the opportunity to choose to bring about a simcha of serving Hashem upon us. Beyond that, not only do we have the ability to make that choice on our own, but the Eibishter himself commands us to do so. Where we know the commandment of that we have to serve Hashem, Avadatas Hashem Elokecha b'simcha v'tuv leivav. Beginning of the pasuk uses the negative structure for that particular pasuk, but the commandment there is that we have an obligation to serve the Eibishter. So not only do we choose to do it, but the Eibishter commanded us, and that we can fulfill the Eibishter's commandment by serving him with joy. This is a 5th level of Simcha. A 6th level of Simcha is a Simcha that comes about by fulfilling a specific commandment, a specific mitzvah. So we have the mitzvah of mayadim l'simcha, as mentioned before. So there's the earlier aspect that we talked about, which is a simcha of a particular time. There we go. Of a particular time of the year. But there's another level of simcha that we're talking about here now, which is that we have the opportunity to be mesameach, to fulfill that commandment, to be besimcha within the time of year that is a zman for simcha. And finally, the seventh one is that within Moyadim L'Simcha, within the Yom Tovim in general, you have Zman Simcha Senu, which is Chag HaSukkos. So on Sukkos, based on this, on Sukkos we have the potential anyway to achieve the greatest level of Simcha above and beyond all the other six. As I said, it's interesting to note that the Rebbe on the very first one says that there's no simcha greater than that, and I'm sure there's much to be again discussed about that and how these other levels are actually increases on something that's that can't be surpassed. But I'll leave that for now. So this idea that there is a special commandment for us to be besimcha on Chag HaSukkos, we can look a little closer at what does that mean and how are we supposed to do it. So the Rebbe in another place in Likutei Sichos extensively treats the commandment, the mitzvah we have not just on Sukkos but throughout all the Yom Tovim to increase in our simcha and to do things that bring about joy. And the most well known and the one that is talked about here in most depth is what the Gemara tells us, that the way we are misameach on the Yom Tovim, it's different for men and for women and for children. But b'negei inyanenu tonight, as it relates to men, we are mekayim this mitzvah through eating meat and drinking wine. Ein simcha el b'basar ve'ein simcha el b'yayin. And of course, there's a lengthy discussion about what applies when, zman abayis. There's machlekes. The Rebbe talks, as the Rebbe describes it seems like a machlekes between the Rambam and the Alter Rebbe, if that can be said quite that way. And that the Rambam holds that our drinking wine now in Zman HaGolus is not quite on the level of what eating the basar of the karbanis of Yom Tov, of the Shlomim, was what that accomplished. But the Alter Rebbe holds that the etzem mitzvah of v'samachta b'chagecha is achieved today through drinking wine, and that this is not it's not a lessening of the commandments that we have to engage, to partake of food and drink to bring about the simcha. So this is where I think probably the center point of where this connection in Yiddishkeit comes from, between drinking a beverage and bringing about simcha. Ein simcha ela b'yayin certainly sounds like that's a way to achieve true and ultimate simcha. Now, again, this is probably something that's discussed at length in many places, not just in Chassidus, but we'll stick to that, to the Rebbe's teachings on this. And through the long discussion that the Rebbe gives about Ein Simcha El B'Yayin and what that Simcha means and how the Yayin relates to that and how that fulfills this mitzvah d'oraisa, the Rebbe concludes by saying that it seems that from the opinion of the Alter Rebbe and Shulchan Aruch, the simcha that we're talking about here for Yom Tov is a simcha that's shaykh to the guf. We need to be able to not only be besimcha, whatever that means, it's some kind of abstract concept, but we need to feel it in our body. And this is done through eating and drinking things that bring about a pleasurable feeling, And so, as it relates again to tonight's discussion, and not just to tonight, but to how things are in Zman HaGolus, where it's wine that is the primary thing that brings about Simcha. And in fact, the Rabbi mentions that even as it relates to eating meat, the simcha is not in the meat of the carbon; it's in the actual physical activity of eating the meat. So the Rebbe concludes with a very, very clear statement that in order to be mekayim this mitzvah v'samachta b'chagecha, what we need to do is bring about that simcha in a way that it is felt and it permeates the entire body, and that is the mitzvah of drinking wine on Sukkot and on other Yom Tovim. So it's quite clear then that we have this obligation, and the question then becomes: we may be familiar with either personal or cases, people that we know or that we've seen, where drinking too much can certainly be destructive. So I think at this point the question becomes: first of all, what does this mean? What does it mean to drink wine in an oifen of simcha? And also, how do we prevent against the potential for a destructive outcome, chas v'shalom? So, to clarify this a little further, I would like to, again here, sort of quote or paraphrase, I should say, from a maimer where the Rebbe talks about this issue. The Rebbe talks here about a comparison between Chava, an action of Chava, and an action of Noach. We know the Medrash tells us that one of the ways, or one of the, I should say, interpretations of what it was that Chava gave to Adam to eat, the fruit that she gave him to eat, was grapes, was wine, and so. So a moment here. Oh, here we go. Where the Medrash tells us about Chava, that what she gave to Adam was she took a grape, a cluster of grapes, and she squeezed it, and she gave this to him. And that, of course, that was the according to that Medrash, that was the Chetei Tzadas, and we all know what came from there. We know that 10 generations later, when Adam came out of the Teva, the Torah tells us, Vayita kerem vayesht min hayayin vayishkar, that he planted a vineyard and he drank from the wine and he became intoxicated. And the Rebbe here explains that that Noach was actually attempting to be metaken what Chava attempted to do, or I should not say what Chava attempted to do, but what Chava caused to happen by giving Adam the wine. And so he explains like this, that Noach's intention was that it's known. The pasuk tells us in Shoftim, Yayin hamesameach elakim va'anashim, that wine is something that brings joy. And so Noach figured that by planting a grapevine and by drinking wine, he'll be able to bring about a simcha that will be metaken for the Chetei Tzadas. Now, the connection, or I should say the comparison there, is that Chava also had good intentions and intended to bring about simcha, but Chava's simcha came from a taiva, as the pasuk says, "Vateira ha'isha ki toiva eitz lemachal." She saw that the fruit was good to eat. V'chisava hu le'einayim, and that it was a taiva to her eyes. It was a desire, and that's where she went wrong. And so Noach's attempt was that just as Chava felt was margish, that there was she was margish, the taiva, the desire that drove her to use to eat from the fruit and to give to Adam. Noach also wanted to create a hargasha, a physical sensation, again to be metaken for that, but he was not able to. He did not succeed at this. And why didn't he succeed? He didn't succeed because he misused the wine. Instead of using it as yayin hamasameach, wine that makes one happy, he used it as yayin hamishaker, yayin, that wine that intoxicates. He overdid it. He probably overdid it physically, and he likely overdid it spiritually. And so he went beyond the parameters of how wine can have a positive effect into the wine having a negative effect. The Rebbe points out very interestingly here that when Noach drank the wine, he didn't do it with bittul. And that's why he didn't do it with self-nullification or self-abnegation. And that's why, because he didn't have the bittul, that's why rather than having the outcome, the effect of simcha, he had the effect of intoxication. So to step away from the text for a second, I think this is a key element to the Jewish approach to consuming wine and even becoming intoxicated. There are times in the year, Simchas Torah is coming up, and we know Purim as well, that's a time where there are certainly opinions that say that it's a mitzvah in some cases, or at least some kind of an inyan to drink wine to intoxication. But even wine to intoxication could be yayin hamasameach if there's the component of bittul there as well. And so a surefire way to misuse wine is to do it in a way where one's self and one's arrogance is first and foremost, and others and the Simcha Shal Mitzvah and the things that we're supposed to be more connected to are secondary. And I began to say that, interestingly, the Rebbe notes that even though we said that Noach drank from the wine because he wanted to have this hargasha, he wanted to have this physical sensation, to be metaken for Chava, for her physical desire that she had. The Rebbe says that even though when one becomes intoxicated, they lose their sensitivity, they lose, you lose hargasha, you feel less, but here he says that losing your feeling, or that loss, what we would call in the psychological jargon, that loss of inhibition and that numbing of emotions, that happens. That can happen because of anava and bittul, because of humility and bittul, or it can happen because of bilbul hadas. And the Rebbe says that bilbul hadas, a confusion of the mind, and what probably we could say would be, losing oneself behaviorally and letting oneself too loose. This is actually not the absence of hargasha. This is actually this is an inyan of hargasha. So this is when a person drinks that way, it's in a way where their self is felt in a very critical way, in that it's not for the purposes of, it's not out of humility and bittul. So where else do we have this idea that wine can cause problems? That wine, where do we see else in the Torah where wine is misused? So we know that the other prominent story is the story of Aaron HaKohen and his the two sons of Aaron HaKohen, Nadav and Avihu. And the Torah tells us in Parshas Shmini what they did. That they were makriv in Eish Zara, a carbon that they weren't called on to be makriv, and because they didn't give the carbon the way they were supposed to, or they were not supposed to, and they did it even though they were commanded otherwise, or they were commanded not to, or I should say, even though they were not commanded to. they suffered the penalty, a very severe penalty of death. In Achrei Mos, the beginning of Achrei Mos Kedoshim, which we just read, Achrei Mos I should say, which we just read in Yom Kippur, we find that the Torah records their death, and says it was Bekarva Sam Lifnei Hashem Vayomusu, that they came close to Hashem and they died. And Chassidus has its explanation, its interpretation of that event, and how they were trying to achieve great spiritual heights. But the Torah continues after that and gives a commandment and says, Yain v'shecher al teish ta'ato v'necha. The Eibusher tells Aaron HaKohen that from here forward you shall not drink alcoholic beverages, you shall not become intoxicated before doing the work in the Beis HaMikdash and in the Mishkan in the Beis HaMikdash. Why? Because for similar reasons to what we've talked about so far. Because becoming intoxicated can make someone lose their ability to have a handle on what they're supposed to do, what the Rabbi, I think, referred to in the other places, Bilbul Hadas. And because of that, there's the possibility that one will allow, rather than enhancing their humility and bittul, that it would cause chas v'shalom the opposite. And there's no place for that in the Avodah in the Beis HaMikdash. And so, to this day, Kohanim are warned against excessive drunkenness, especially since, as we know, Mashiach can come any moment, and at that time there will be Kohanim who will have to be prepared to do the Avodah, and so to become intoxicated is particularly problematic for Kohanim. So it's clear that alcohol can be misused. And so the question then becomes, again, what is proper use, and what's proper use, not just physically, not just in terms of how much can one drink or should one be able to drink. I think that's discussed in other places, and there are limitations and various opinions about what those are, and it's certainly not my place to make absolute statements about that. But what I think is important is that we recognize that when we're drinking for Simcha, for Zman Simchasenu, Simchas Beis HaShe'eva, Simchas Torah is coming up, and all of that, that it needs to be with the proper foundation, with the proper background of doing it for the proper intentions. And I think it's safe to say that when one is not doing it for the proper intentions, there's no inyan. There's no advantage to becoming intoxicated if all that's going to happen is you're going to feel more of you and others are going to see more of you. And I think it has been interesting for me. I don't currently do this, but at one point I worked for a while in a drug and alcohol treatment center, and it became apparent to me that there is different ways that people exist, different ways people are when they're intoxicated. Some people easily lose themselves, and when that's the case, I would venture to say that the potential for addiction, for example, is much greater, because you're drinking to, or one who drinks in that way is drinking to lose themselves, which, as I said before, is not in a good way, and does not see through the idea of humility and bittul. But when one knows why they're drinking and knows and focuses and intentionally drinks to bring about a simcha, so that they can do what the Eibusher wants them to do in a time of simcha, and that they know that they're doing it right when they're behaving properly, which is with additional simcha and additional avas Yisrael and avas reim, then you can see when it's a problem and when it's not a problem. Before I conclude, I want to just bring out one or two more points that are discussed at length in Likutei Torah of the Alter Rebbe, in Drushim L'Sukkos. There's a mimer that I believe is, you always hear, oh, it's a well-known mimer, a well-known sikha. I don't know what's well-known, because most of the time when it's something well-known, I've never heard of it before. And of course that's a new confession that I make, that maybe I should know more of the well-known maimarim. But anyways, I believe this Ushafta Mayim B'Sasein is known as a well-known maimer. And the Alter Rebbe here, I think, really talks about, in very lofty oisias, but I think it's not a leap to make some very practical interpretations and applications to his to how he explains this idea of here it's focused on Nisach HaMayim and Nisach HaYayin. So as specifically as it relates to the practice of Nisach HaYayin on Sukkos, the Alter Rebbe teaches us as follows. He says like this. I think it's Gewaldike Oisius. It really spoke to me. Simcha, the idea of Simcha is Gilui HaHelam. Simcha is the idea of revealing something that's hidden within us. When we find ourselves having Simcha in the proper way, what we're doing is we're actuating a potential that we've had, and we're bringing it out into an apparent way that others can see, that we can experience something that we actually feel physically in our body. There are sensations that come along with joy, as well as others can sometimes see that as well. And there's this idea of Simcha is connected to the concept of Bina. Of all the spheres, Bina is the one that's related to Simcha. Why? Because Bina has the similar theme of revealing that which was concealed. The concept of Chachma is one of where a nugget of wisdom exists in its most concentrated, condensed form, and the idea of Bina is the expression of that into many details and into a way that can be understood and delivered to others and so forth. So this, in a similar way, Simcha is this idea of drawing out from within. And so he then connects us to the Avodah of the Leviim, and then he says, and this was done through the shiur, through the song of the Leviim, which was done ala yayin, on wine. What's the advantage of wine? What does it bring out for us? As I mentioned before, the pasuk yayin hamasameach elikim va'anoshim, that wine has this property of bringing about happiness, and the happiness that's brought about by wine is not just a happiness where internally we now feel happy when we previously didn't feel happy, but it also extends that happiness to another person, because sometimes something could happen to you and you feel happy. A very personal example that happened yesterday. Yesterday, there was the completion of a sale of a house. I owned a house, and the closing was yesterday, and the house now belongs to Baruch Hashem, another Lubavitcher family, and so forth. That was a joyous feeling. It was a joyous feeling for me, because for a number of reasons, and it was a joyous feeling for the buyer as well. And if you've ever purchased a home, there's a certain geschmack, there's a certain satisfaction that comes with that. But you could have that satisfaction and walk to mincha, and the person davening next to you doesn't necessarily know that something transpired. But wine and drinking an alcoholic beverage has this ability to so to speak, to allow you to exude the simcha to others, so that others also experience this simcha that you're having. This is also connected, I'm not going to connect it in depth, but also connected to the idea of nichnas yayin yotza soid, that when wine goes in, secrets come out. Again, that same theme that what was hidden now becomes revealed. And so a final point here, so I think that is the final point, but to tie it together, so what we see here is that when when alcohol is used in a way that it brings about a true simcha, and it brings about a simcha that not only you feel, but that you can spread to others and bring them an increase in joy, that's a fantastic koyach that we have, and a zchus that we have. And unless you're someone who knows that drinking either in small amounts or in large amounts leads to not good things, we have a commandment to do so. As I said before, the mitzvah of a samachta b'chagecha is through drinking. And you have to drink, you have to drink at least the revi'as, and you have to drink, and we know now that you have to drink in a way that you actually feel it, and that it makes you feel good, and that your mindset is in the right way, and so forth. But of course, we need to be aware of our limitations and the limitations of those around us. Sometimes there are people around us who struggle with this kind of a nisayon, or you could call it a disease or an addiction or however you might think of it, and so in those cases it's very important to be mindful. Avos Yisrael means that you're not thinking of yourself, you're thinking of the other. Bittul and anava means that you're not thinking of yourself, you're thinking of the other. So if you know and you're satisfactorily convinced that by drinking you can not only feel joy but spread that joy, then you know you're doing it in a way that's according to the Torah. And if you're aware of other people around you, that this is going to bring them down and this is going to be a pitfall for them, then you need to be very careful, I think, about how you do that. So with that, I conclude tonight. Thank you for watching and for participating. And if you have any comments or questions, certainly put them in above, and I'll do my best to respond.